Bob D'Angelo. It's so
Jefferson.
wonderful to have you back at Fredonia for our 50th anniversary of the building. I think of you as the founding director, even though I know you weren't. But tell me about what you know about the history of the place before you arrived.
Before I arrived. Well, it was only open less than a year before I arrived. And the director, the initial director, his job was basically to get it built and open, which I've served that function in other places and moved on after it was. But I guess he wanted to stay. And he had some problems with the music department faculty because he and his wife were both musicians and wanted dual appointments. They were both organists.
Oh.
And it didn't work out. And I guess his contract might have been up for renewal. And the job was vacant when I applied for it. And it had been vacant for about 6 weeks. I guess the first round of advertising did not produce a candidate that was acceptable. And I know why. Because the first round they advertised that the PhD was required. And I don't know anybody with a PhD except one person who could manage an art center back then, and that was Joseph Golden, who was my
right.
professor
He wrote
at
the
Syracuse, and he wrote the book about it. And he wasn't interested. He was building a theater in Syracuse. So I answered an ad, and 3 weeks went by, and I got a call from Robert Marvel, Bob Marvel, the dean, newly minted dean. He had been the head of the music department. And he said, we'd like to talk to you about coming up here and managing our art center in Fredonia. And I said, like I said in the program, I said to him, when? And he said, Monday. This was a Thursday. And I said, I'll drive up Monday morning. And he said to me, if you do, you might get here by dark if you don't get lost. It's a long way from New York. I was in Connecticut at the time. And so I found out, I got the map out and found out where Fredonia
Right.
was. And
I've had that happen with artists.
and I said to my wife, would you live up there? Because neither one of us had ever lived in a city smaller than Syracuse or New Haven, Connecticut. We met in Syracuse, and then we both went to school in New Haven for a while. And she said, sure. Is it cold up there? I said, I bet it is, because I went to school in Syracuse, which is not all that far. So I got here, and there wasn't the history. There wasn't the demand for this building. It was not driven by a need. It was driven largely by a state construction fund that had a need to spend money. And there's no real reason why this was plopped down here and why this school was first. The first one of these performing arts centers probably should have been at the emerging campus in Purchase, which had a professionally based fine arts program. They had faculty who were from New York, working actors, working directors, working teachers, working producers who came up to teach. Dancers who you've heard of would come up to teach. And it was like an hour commute. And they'd come up 2 or 3 days. Norris Houghton, who was a famous theater director, was the head of the theater program at Purchase. And Bill Bales, who was an internationally famous dancer, was the head of the dance program.
But I thought that campus was built as an arts school.
Yes, it was.
But
they
how
didn't.
did we predate them then?
The art school was there before they built their facility.
Okay.
Their facility opened, I think, 3 years
So
after
they were
I got
teaching
here.
classes in the arts.
In
but
substandard
not-
facilities. They did not
Gotcha.
have performance spaces.
Gotcha.
And they were teaching classes in substandard facilities. And by all rights, this should have gone there. But I think politics had something to do with it. There was a Republican governor at the time, Nelson Rockefeller, and I don't know what the politics are here now, but Western New York was pretty Republican back then. And Purchase, just outside of New York City, was pretty liberal. And so I think politics had something to do with where the money went. But certainly nothing I could find in a record indicated that this place would get used. Now, just about the time I came here, they started a theater department.
Right.
The dance department was part of physical education. I don't know where the art department was working. They got,
Prior to here.
to here, I don't know where they were working.
Yeah, they were probably in Old Main downtown.
They might have been. Old Main was closed when I got here.
Oh, okay.
And one of the jobs I was given was to see if I could come up with a use for Old Main.
Oh,
And I didn't come up with one. I don't know what it is. Is it a senior residence?
It's subsidized or low-income senior housing.
Senior house, that's what I thought. We could not come up with another use that wouldn't compete with ourselves. You know, you put a show in there, then it takes it out of
Right.
here. But we had to come up, there was no history demanding this place, and we had to come up with uses other than just student performances, although we had a lot of them. You know, the concert hall, I would say, a third to a half of our performances were student-based.
Right.
And the rest of it were road-based, and there was no community use. The community was,
Right.
no organizations in the community were ever interested in renting. I think we rented out to a bunch of high school graduations.
Right, well,
from the
we
region.
still do.
Still do.
Every year.
And I think we did 15 or 16 high school graduations a year.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they
We
could-
just do Dunkirk and Fredonia
30
now.
miles away they'd come, 40 miles away to do high school graduations.
Now a lot of them have their nice own
They owned
facilities.
it.
Yeah.
Well, every new high school auditorium is called a performing arts center.
What do you know about, if anything, how the building got its name?
I think they just got up the nerve to ask the governor if it was okay. They were looking for a name for it. There was no donor. It was state funds. And somebody knew somebody who could get it in front of the governor. And it was as simple as that. They wanted a name on it. They wanted a name that was recognizable. And I could tell you honestly, in the early portion of my career here, I used to joke. I said, I'm the executive director of the Michael C. Rockefeller Center for the Arts. And after that, it's all downhill. The title was the best
Yeah.
part of the job in the early days. It was a struggle. It was a struggle getting shows to come here. It was a struggle getting sponsorship and getting any money to do anything. And so, but it had that name on it. And most people I told that to at professional meetings thought I was in New York City.
Yes, I've
You know,
had that happen
they just
to me.
assumed this had something to do with
Center.
Rockefeller Center.
Right.
And then next thing they asked me, do you have Michael Rockefeller's collection here? And I said, we've occasionally had some of it shipped to us
Right.
to put up for a month or two, and then we pack it up carefully and ship it back. But no, the collection's not here. The stuff that they're not worried about breaking gets
Yeah.
sent here occasionally.
I was in the archives on campus in Reed Library the other day and came across the brochure, the announcement of the Michael C. Rockefeller collection of Aboriginal art that was here the first year it was open.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We got some pieces after that,
Oh,
too.
okay.
We got some, and then somebody sent us 15 Remingtons
Oh,
that were in some archive someplace locked up. And so we had an exhibit of 15 Remingtons for a while. Originals, not the recast at a smaller size. We originally didn't know what to do with the art gallery either. And then the art department hired a gallery director, a guy named Jesse Wright. And he created some very interesting shows and catalogs. And catalogs cost a lot of money. And we didn't always have sponsors for those catalogs. The show I remember most, well, I remember two shows. I remember the show called Crash. And it was car wreck parts welded together. And then sculptures made out of chrome bumpers and stuff. And we printed a very elaborate catalog of that, for which it took years to pay off the bills because nobody buys catalogs. And the other show I remember, and I remember only because of the circumstances of the opening night, and I had nothing to do with the gallery. I just went to their shows. And the show was called 10 Artists Who Also Happen to Be Women. And the first picture you saw when you walked in was a self-portrait of an artist naked on a chaise lounge. And the person in front of me was the president of a local corporation whose name escapes me, and he gave the classic line. He said, I don't know much about art, but I know what I like. And that's actually the first time I've ever heard that line said out loud. And it was in this gallery. And I think that show was traveling around the state. It wasn't assembled for us. But the Crash show was assembled here. Some of the work was made here by faculty, and then it went on tour. But it cost us a lot of money. We had to bail that out over a period of years because of the printing of the catalog.
now you were involved in taking student ensembles out on tour,
Well,
weren't you?
part of my predecessor's job description was to manage touring. And we had student ensembles. We had, well, the symphony. We had a brass ensemble, a wind ensemble, and a chamber orchestra. And it was also a string quartet, wind quintet, brass quintet, percussion ensemble.
Yeah.
And we used to sell those to local schools for whatever we could get because I wasn't paying any talent. And the music department had a budget for transportation. So whatever we could get in revenue was gravy. And it was anywhere from $25, for a wind ensemble or brass ensemble to $400 or $500 for the symphony going someplace. And one of the times we did an incredibly big tour. Pittsburgh Symphony renovated an old movie palace in Pittsburgh to become Heinz Hall. And part of the deal, we made a deal with them. They came here for residency and performed the Berlioz Requiem for 2 nights here to local audiences. And we filled the place
Wow.
for the Berlioz Requiem with the Pittsburgh Symphony. And I don't know if you know the piece, but it requires 18 timpani.
Oh, wow.
So it requires 6 players, and it requires 4 antiphonal brass choirs
Wow.
scattered all around the hall. And then after we finished performing here, we put 350 college students with the antiphonal brass choirs and the timpanists and the timpani and everything in a truck, and we went to Pittsburgh. And
To open the hall there.
it was like the 3rd week or 4th week of the hall. The first really big event. I think they opened with celebrities, not with the symphony, or the symphony backing up somebody like Frank Sinatra singing. I don't know what their opening was. And we rehearsed it in Pittsburgh in Heinz Hall. And we took over the old Pick Roosevelt Hotel where my wife and I got the presidential suite, because we had brought 350 paying customers. And we had to arrange to get them there, to feed them, to house them, and to babysit them. There were only 7 of us, my wife and I and five other people that took care of these kids. And we had our share. One young man broke his ankle. He fell off a curb, so he says. Probably more likely a bar stool, but nothing serious happened. But that's the largest group I've ever had to chaperone, and I didn't stray far from the hotel and the theater. But if somebody, we did go to the emergency room to pick that young man up and get him back. But he performed. He was a singer, and he limped on the stage and performed. It was a great time, and they paid us $20,000.
Wow.
In out of one
1970.
budget, yeah, out of one budget, we paid to bring them here, and then they paid us, and it went into a different pocket, and we made very good use of that money. But yeah, we toured maybe 200 different performances a year, mostly to elementary schools and middle schools, and it got the college's name out there, and I'm sure this was a recruitment tool that had been set up long before I got here.
Well, that responsibility is still in the official state job description,
Okay.
which must have been written at that time,
It was in my job
and it's still
description
there,
when I came.
and it's still there. And I occasionally do it, but not often.
But what's funny about when I came, my job description, we negotiated a salary, and the only job title they had open was the university librarian position, college librarian. So I was my working title was either managing director or executive director of the Arts Center, but my payroll title was director of the library, and then they had to find another payroll title for me when they actually filled the job of director of the library with a lovely man. I think he was Swedish, John Solitas. I don't know.
He was here when I
He was
came.
here. Was he Swedish?
Latvian or something like that.
Yeah, and he, instead of calling me D'Angelo, used to call me Diabolo because he thought I was always up to some mischief. He said, "You stole my title."
Well, what was the most mischievous thing you did?
Oh, I don't think
Okay.
I was too young in my career.
Okay.
Later on in my career, no, I guess the one thing I did was bring a concert version of Jesus Christ Superstar here, and nobody here knew what it was except Blasphemy. The title was
Oh, yeah.
Blasphemy, and it was a concert version started at the University of Indiana in Bloomington, using some students and some of the people who were on the album. At that point, Jesus Christ Superstar was only an album,
Right.
a concept album, and it sold who knows how many hundreds of thousands of records. And the university put together a concert version of that without permission. and they sent it on tour. And we were the second stop. They played their auditorium here, and then they came here. And until people heard it, they thought what I was doing was scandalous, from the president and the dean on down. And I couldn't get them to listen to the album. I had listened to the album, so I knew there was nothing offensive in there. And although I'm not a Christian scholar, I knew they were telling a pretty accurate story.
Yeah, right.
You know, the story was a true story, and it was a teaching tool. And if it saved you having to read the Bible for 5 years, you know, and to learn this stuff, it was a good. It had a purpose. So I brought it here, and everybody would say, "Why would you bring that here?" I said, "Well, the students wanted me to," and we were still beholden to the students in what we brought in. I was the advisor to something called the Convocations Commission, and a man named Willard Gettert was its other advisor. We were co-advisors. And I think he was a physics professor. He was in the hard
can't
science.
remember his
He was in the
field.
hard. He was in the hard sciences, and we used their money to bring shows here.
And that was based on a student fee.
Yeah, we had a small percentage of the student fee. Maybe we got $12 or $13 a year per student, but in exchange for that, the students had a vote, had a voice in what came here, and it was our job to convince them that certain things were their idea. You know,
see.
they had no interest in the Juilliard String Quartet, but we convinced them they did. We really shouldn't have brought the Juilliard String Quartet here because the hall was too big.
Yeah, right.
You know, we should have put them in the Marvel Theater, but there was no acoustical shell.
Right.
But the students had a say, and we let them have their say sometimes. And they wanted Jesus Christ Superstar, and we went in collaboration with a Buffalo promoter. And brought it here. So I think that was probably the most outrageous thing I did because the title was outrageous. There was nothing outrageous about the show. It still remains one of my favorite shows.
Right.
And
Now, you were also involved in bringing Mummenschanz here.
Arthur Schaffman, who discovered Mummenschanz, if you can really be discovered, you know, in a basement theater in Zurich, and called me up and said, "We need to bring them to the United States. You need to get here, first of all, tomorrow to see them." So I went. And it was a little bit more than tomorrow. It was a day and a half later when I got there.
To Switzerland.
To see the show. Fortunately, I had a passport. And I helped him bring it here and tour. And we played the very first performance in North America ever. It was the day before Good Friday. I believe it was 1972 or 3. We booked them for 2 shows. School was not out here the following week. For whatever reason, our break was not corresponding to the Easter week. And so we booked them for the Thursday night before the week, Good Friday and Easter Sunday, and for the Monday after. And they were playing someplace else on the Saturday in between. That's sort of unheard of, but there were no sets.
Yeah.
It was just
Right.
props.
And this was in Marvel Theater.
In the Marvel
how
Theater. No,
did
we
you-
did them in here. I'm sorry.
Really?
We did them in here, and we had about 500 people for the first performance.
To something nobody had ever heard of.
Yeah, I didn't have access
pretty
to the
good.
Marvel Theater back then. It belonged to the theater department. And it was mostly a student audience, and the word spread out, and we had about 900 people or 1,000 people for the second performance. Well, we toured this show. I had a little ownership in it. We paid almost nothing. I think we paid $700 for the 2 performances. And we broke even because the tickets were cheap, and I think students were free. Or if they weren't free, they were 50 cents or $1. And the show toured around for about a $1,200 fee for 3 or 4 years, 5 years. And it finally went to the College of Purchase. And it played at the College of Purchase, and Clive Barnes, who was then the theater and dance critic for the New York Times, the lead theater and dance critic for the New York Times, came to see it. And he wrote a rave review and said, "This show belongs on Broadway." So we figured we'd take the show to Broadway for a limited run, that he would again give it that kind of review. And maybe we'd get a couple of other good reviews if we could get anybody to come see it. It was a mime show. And it ran 3.5 years.
Wow.
Yeah, we got 23 reviews in the first 3 weeks from regional New York City and regional press and television and radio, and they were all at least a 7.5 out of 10, and we got a lot of 10s. And the show ran, we opened in 77 and we played till 81. I think those are the years.
Now, how did you know Arthur?
Arthur and I, well, we actually met here.
At Fredonia?
I booked one of his shows,
Okay.
and we became instant friends. I booked one of his shows, and then when I opened the Performing Arts Center in Tulsa some years later, he came out for the opening and took care of my then 5-year-old son for the whole weekend, brought him to the opening events, but monitored him. And we've been friends basically. We went to the same high school, but he was 5 years older than me, so we didn't know each other in high school. And I met Arthur here in 1970 because I had booked one of his shows.
And was he traveling with it?
He was
as
traveling
as
with
the
the company manager.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Basically, booking agents did everything back then.
Okay.
Of small agencies with small acts. It was Jose Molina's Bailes Espanol. And he owned the company. And he billed it as a flamenco dance company from Spain. Jose Molina was, in fact, from Spain. However, all the other dancers were not. The female dancers were all Puerto Ricans, and the male dancers were Jewish boys from New York in makeup. But it was a good company. And I was reminded back when I was in college, I worked for the guy who did the booking at Syracuse University. And we had a company in the fall and a company in the spring. And they were both booked by the same agent, Alberto Marini, who sent out dance companies, singing dance companies. And it was the singers and dancers from sunny Ireland in the fall and the singers and dancers from sunny Italy in the spring. And I had gone out with one of the young ladies. They were in town for 2 days, this cute little redheaded girl. And we had a couple of beers because it was legal to drink at 18 back then. And she called me up 5 months later when the singers and dancers from sunny Italy were there, and she was part of that group also. and this time she had black hair. So she did whatever show he did, she dressed up in that ethnicity. And they sang songs in a different language that they didn't understand. But I met Arthur here. I went a long way off of your question. I met Arthur here, and we became lifelong friends, and I spoke at his funeral 5 years ago at Sardi's in New York. And what was astounding is there was, in the room at Sardi's, there was the guy who used to do all the drawings for the Broadway programs, had done a 16-panel drawing. It was 16 Broadway luminaries from 1978.
Wow.
Producers mostly. And Arthur's picture was on the wall as I walked in. And I almost couldn't do my speech. I mean, when I was in New York, when I didn't have an apartment in New York, I kept an apartment for many years. When I didn't have an apartment, I slept in his. And when he was ever in a town for a show, he slept in my house. My mother became his travel agent and for all of his shows. We were that close. And I was really broken up when he passed on.